for the generosity that's enabled us to present this lecture. Now, this series is now in its second year. This is really an extraordinarily appropriate and a wonderful testimony and monument to the memory of Sam Chu, who I knew as a young faculty member, who was very kind and generous to me, as he was to all of his colleagues. And those of us who remember him with deep fondness. So it's my pleasure to introduce Shigehisa Kuriyama. I got that right. Yes. Okay. All right. Who is the Rushhour Institute Professor of Cultural History and Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization at the Harvard University. Professor Kuriyama studied at Harvard and received his PhD from the Department of History of Science in 1986 and joined the Harvard faculty as the Rushhour Professor in 2005 after stints at the University of New Hampshire, Emory University, and the International Research Center for Japanese Study in Kyoto, Japan. His research explores really fascinating and very broad philosophical themes: being and time, representations and reality, knowing and feeling. And he explores these through the lens of specific topics in comparative medical history, topics that span the globe, really, from East Asia to Western Europe. His book, The Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine, received the 2001 William H. Welch Medal from the American Association of the History of Medicine, and been translated into Chinese, Greek, Spanish, and Korean, a book that's obviously had a tremendous impact around the world. His recent work includes studies on the history of distraction, which we would all benefit from studying. The imagination of strings and the experience of presence, which I'm very interested to hear more about. The transformation of money into a palpable humor in Edo Japan, and the nature of hiddenness in traditional Japanese medicine, and the web of connections binding ginseng, opium, tea, silver, and MSG. Fascinating. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Kuriyama is actively engaged in expanding the horizons of teaching and scholarly communication through creative uses of digital technologies. He's a pioneer in the development of course trailers at Harvard. He founded the Harvard Shorts competition for scholarly clips, and he's held workshops on multimedia presentations and research for faculty and students at many universities around the world. Professor Kuriyama's stellar credentials make him an absolutely fitting choice to deliver this lecture in Sam's honor. He will enlighten us with a paper entitled The Travel of Anxieties, Rethinking the Impact of Western Medicine on Japanese Conceptions of the Body. Please join me in giving a warm Buckeye welcome to Professor Shigehisa Kuriyama as the 2015 Samuel Chu Memorial Lecturer in East Asian Studies at The Ohio University.
Thank you all for coming in, and thank you, Mrs. True, and your family for allowing me to speak here. It's a great honor to be at Ohio State University. It's a great pleasure. It's late in the afternoon. Maybe we'll start with a little warming up exercise. If everybody could just stretch their hands like this. Turn your hands this way. Yeah, everybody has their hands this way. This way. Yeah, exactly. Then put your hands together. Bring your hands back. Okay? Put your fingers underneath your chin. Yeah. And then can you do this without chances are probably about at least 78 to 80% of you can't do this. But there's no trick to it. You just do it, just like this. If you can't do it, all you have to do is change your finger by, if you're doing it one way, you're doing it like this, just change your position by one finger, right, and you'll be able to do it. The reason I'm starting with this is basically a very simple point, which is the importance of changing habits. That we have certain ways of doing things, we get used to them, and they become so obvious, so natural that they come to seem obvious. But once we change our habit just a little bit, then what seemed improbable or impossible becomes trivial. That's sort of the kind of idea that I want to present with respect to how we think about Western medicine in East Asia, in particular Japan. So the structure of my talk is very simple. I'm going to focus on one image, although I'll show other images as well, but I'm focusing on one image, which was created around 1850. And it looks like this. I want to ask a specific question generated by this question, by this image, and then frame it in some broader issues, or with an aim, with the idea of addressing broader issues. The specific question I want to ask, so this is the basic idea. The specific question I want to ask is, how did Western medicine affect traditional Japanese ideas of the body? This is a question to which, in the historiography of Japan, there's a very clear and standard answer, which I'll get to in just a moment. But by looking at this question, I want to address two broader questions. What is medical knowledge all about? We have a certain idea of medical knowledge. I want to sort of focus on something that has received relatively little attention. Not only rethink Japanese medicine, but also rethink Western medicine, because I think it's essential to rethink Western medicine in order to rethink its impact. The other is the broader question is, how does knowledge travel? Today, global history, transnational history is a major sort of a direction in the study of history. Talk about this, particularly the circulation of material goods, the travel of ideas. I want to look at a somewhat different dimension and think about the logic that underlies travel. The way this image was very popular in the mid-19th century is as evidenced by the fact that there's still many copies of this image in many libraries around the world. So many copies have survived. And so it also appears in many medical histories, Japanese medical histories. And the way it's presented almost always is some version of this, that it's presented as a vision of the traditional Japanese view of the body, because it sort of looks like a traditional view. It looks like this. In some sense, this is perfectly understandable. As I said, this was composed 1850, before the Meiji Restoration. You can see that it's very different from the kind of view of the body that we associate with Western scientific medical knowledge, the anatomical view of the body. And so, just to go back for a second, you have this vision of the body, which clearly doesn't look anatomical, but is a nice vision, one might say, of, say, microcosm and macrocosm, the social body and the medical body. And it's different from something like this. So it looks like a pre-Western vision of the body. Oh, sorry, and indeed, there are many elements that suggest this is very traditional. So that if you look, for example, at the title of this, it invokes this idea of the care of life. The Japanese use yojo, Chinese yamsheng. This is a very traditional idea of how to maintain health, how to cultivate vitality. So the title is very traditional, and this is the ideal that was fundamental to Chinese medicine, the idea of cultivating life. element which is also very traditional is if you were able to read the descriptions of the different organs. The descriptions of the organs are taken directly from the major Chinese classical medicine, and it's written in a very classical Japanese style. It's for those who study Japanese, it's the nani-bu, right? It's classical Japanese. So everything suggests that it's a very traditional vision. And this makes sense because this is still 1850. 1868 is when the Meiji Restoration occurs. 1874 is when the government decides that the official medicine in Japan will be Western medicine. Right? So we're still a quarter of a century before this. So all of this makes it seem perfectly reasonable that we should have still have a traditional view of the body. Still, it's a puzzle. Because if you think about the way in which the history of Japanese medicine has traditionally been told, 1850 has a particular significance, and that is that it's nearly 3/4 of a century, or a little more than 3/4 century, after this work called Kaitai Shinsho by Sumida Genpaku, a translation of a Japanese anatomy text, which is almost always talked about as the beginning of the study of the West, and certainly the beginning of modern Western medicine in Japan. So in the traditional narrative, the introduction of anatomy in 1774 was sort of the critical turning point. But here we are 3/4 of a century later, and you see very little trace of that. So it makes you wonder how significant really was the Kaitai Shinsho in the history of Japanese medicine. So this is obviously a quote that's often given, and I'm basically arguing against it. So the received account of the history of Japanese medicine is prior to, of course I'm schematizing, but prior to Kaitai Shinsho, you have a traditional view of the body, and gradually after Kaitai Shinsho, you have the development of a modern Western view of the body centered around anatomy. So that the acquisition of anatomy was the critical impact of Western science on Japanese medicine. I'm calling that into question partly because saying, look, 75 years later, you still don't really see the traces of this. So how significant was this? And you know that, of course, the image that I've shown you is a popular image, and yet still, you would still expect more of that impact. So how should we think about this? My argument is that despite this lack of evidence of Western impact, in fact, the picture that I showed you at the beginning, in fact, displays a lot of very profound Western influence, but it's hidden in a way, and that the real impact of Western medicine was something quite different than has been recognized thus far. So this image actually has a number of parts. There's the title, there's the explanation of the viscera, and as I said, both these are very traditional. They reflect essentially the view of the body that you could find in traditional Japan, and it actually originally goes back to traditional ancient China. But there are two other parts of the picture. One is the inside of the body with figures and conversations, and then the preface. And if you look at those parts of the picture, you get a very different view of what's going on. So here's the title, the explanation of the viscera, and then you have the inside of the body, and the preface. I'm just going to talk about these. So if we look at this lower part, can you see anything Western here? jump out at you. Not jump out, but. How about this guy? What is he doing? Did you see him?
Smoking.
Yes.
Smoking tobacco.
He's not smoking tobacco, although that's a really good guess. That's actually a very good guess, but he's not smoking. Similar gestures. What's going on? They're holding their nose. They're saying it really stinks in here. And basically my point, I'm a very simple-minded person. My point is that simple. Basically that this idea of a stinky body is the primary contribution of Western medicine to Japan. But it's a very significant one. So if we look at the details of this picture, you can see that this processing of waste occupies inordinate part, the great part of this illustration. So what is the body? We think of the body in different kinds of ways. There are different possibilities of thinking about the body, but here, what you see is a vision of the body centered around the processing of waste. So the basic argument that I'm going to make is that the sense of putridity, the sense of a stinky interior, is the main impact of Western medicine on Japanese. Why? And if you look at the preface, it has this very peculiar thing. It says, all human beings are equal because, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, or smart or foolish, we all have these wastes inside us. So it's this democracy of excrement. And what I want to emphasize is this is quite alien to the traditional Chinese view of the body. It's quite alien to the basically East Asian vision. But it's fundamental to traditional Western medicine. Now, Sugita Genpaka was the person who was the chief sort of team leader in the group that translated this work in 1774, the anatomy. And this is a work that's well known. But about a quarter century later, he published another work on regimen. So, in 1801, he published this book on regimen about what to do to keep yourself healthy. And here he says something that, again, is very unusual for traditional East Asian texts on regimen. He talks about the excremental residues of food, and that the food can pollute the blood and cause disease. So this fear that food will remain in the body, create corruption, and therefore give rise to disease. This is not a traditional East Asian view of the body. But this is the belief about the body that Sugita Genpaka incorporates along with anatomical ideas. And this is the idea that sticks. So, to understand the significance of this, you have to rethink Western medicine. But you also have to rethink about what traditional medicine is altogether. If you read most survey histories of medicine, they'll say traditional medicine is above all concerned with balance, whether it's the 5 phases, the 4 humors, the various dosha. And so the vision of the body is something like this, that health, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the idea is that health is balanced and sickness occurs when you get out of balance. Right? So what is the remedy for sickness? It's simply redressing that balance and you're fine. This is a view that I'm suggesting is actually a very inaccurate view of traditional medicine. It's a distorted view, but it's a very popular view because it's not totally without foundation. It's a popular view because doctors want to promote that view too. The reason doctors want to promote that view is that that ideal balance and imbalance make doctors seem like natural philosophers. So according with a cosmic vision of the world, which the elements are in balance, there's an ideal order, and as long as doctors are talking like that, they seem exactly like natural philosophers. But if you actually look at what people do in practice, they behave very differently. And what I would suggest is that what that traditional view, or the received view, neglects is the role of anxiety. That in order to really think about what medicine is about, one has to think about the role of anxiety. So that instead of assuming balance as the de facto, as the natural state, one has to imagine something like a slope, like the slope of health, where you're making an effort constantly to stay at a healthy state. Just like you probably feel that if you don't, I'm getting exhausted just watching. That if you don't exercise, do certain things to keep up your health, you'll slide down. So what I'm suggesting is that in all traditions, there is some vision of a slope, that you have to make an effort to stay healthy. And that one of the main differences between traditions is the nature of that slope, right? What is that? What is the direction? So the idea is that if you stop, right, then you will decline, you will get sick. And the question is, what is this, the high point and low point? And I want to illustrate this by a picture of this man at a meal. The meal, you can sort of see that this meal is half eaten. And if you look closely, you can see that this glass is oddly precariously balanced on the edge. It's almost like it's about to fall off. And you're unsure about the attitude of the eater. Right? Has he stopped? Is he about to start eating? It's almost like he's sort of withdrawing with a little horror of realization. So what is this about? The key here is that he's eating, and he's drawing on a traditional vision of the body of food that goes back to Greek antiquity. It's a view that gets especially prominent in Galen. The view goes something like this: that there's food, and what happens with food? Food is where you get the four humors. The four humors thing you've probably heard of: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. But the thing that's important about this is that only part of that food becomes blood and becomes flesh. Most of it becomes waste. And becomes essentially a toxic poison. So, although people talk about the balance of the four humors, very, very little emphasis actually in traditional texts about the virtues or the functions of the four humors. Mostly they're basically pathological toxins. Humors basically cause disease. So there's this vision of food, which is this very ambiguous vision of food. I'm talking about the Western tradition now. It's a very ambiguous vision of food, where most of food is a potential pathogen, right? It can cause disease by becoming waste. And only a certain part becomes nutrition that replenishes the body as it gets worn down. Oh, sorry. That's this one. So there's a constant need to purify the body. And unless you understand this scheme, you can't understand why it is that in Western medicine there's such an obsession with things like purging, bloodletting, and enemas. So just to give a famous example, Louis XVII, in 1 year he's bled 42 times, right? This is more than three times a month. He's also getting an incredible number of purging. So he's constantly throwing up. I'm sorry, getting at the end. He's constantly throwing up and being subjected to enemas. Right? So almost on a daily basis. This is something that seems very strange now. Right? This seems very peculiar. And of course, he had royal prerogative, so he could do this more than others. But the mentality was very pervasive. Right? This idea that there's always this anxiety that what the food that you consume can remain inside you, can fester and cause disease. So you have to constantly be worried about purifying the body. This was given particular impetus by this figure that I showed you earlier named Santorio, who was born in this period when it was in vogue for people to have the same first and last names. And Santorio is famous for a number of reasons, among which was this idea of quantification. So what does Santorio do? He may be one of the first people in European history to weigh himself daily. And so that practice of, I don't know how many of you go stand on your scales daily, but you owe a lot to him. But probably, but you do it probably for slightly different reasons than than the original inspiration, Santorio. So you can see he's actually sitting on a scale. Right? He's weighing himself. And what he does, he weighs himself, his weight every day. He weighs the food and drink that he consumes every day. And he weighs his excrement. And what does he discover? He discovers something really surprising. He discovers that for every 8 pounds of food and drink that he consumes, he only excretes 3 pounds of feces and urine. So it's like magic. 5 pounds have disappeared. So what is the answer to this? What's happened? Where has that gone? Right.
So it's converted into gas as exhaled?
Ah, very good. Yes. So this is his answer. And this is based on a traditional idea, but he's the first one to sort of quantify this. It says it's insensible perspiration. You get these vapors that escape through the pores. But you can see it's a huge amount, right? It's 5 pounds. So then people become obsessed with the pores. This is John Buchan, William Buchan, who publishes this popular text of domestic medicine, self-help in Europe. It says insensible perspiration is the greatest of all discharges from the human body. It's of so great importance to health that few diseases attack us while it goes properly on, but when it's obstructed, the whole frame is soon disordered. You can understand this, right? If 5 pounds have to constantly be excreted, if that gets blocked, then you have all this waste accumulating inside you. This is one of my favorite calculations. John Arbuthnot calculates, so according to this, so every 24 hours you're perspiring 1/34 of an inch. The surface area of the skin is 15 square feet. The surface area of 2,900 people is 1 acre. So that this amount of people will cover 1 acre with 1 inch of perspiration for 34 days. And if you extend that calculation, so you have to sort of imagine that we're bathed in this ocean of exhalations from the body. Again, this kind of thing now seems very odd, but this was really made perfect sense in Western medicine. So what I'm arguing is that this vision of accumulating excrement is what gets transferred to Japan. So you can read this, what was the most popular text of domestic medicine in the early 19th century Japan. And he says, oh, sorry, yes, you can't read it, but again, he's saying he's essentially repeating what he finds in Western texts, that all these wastes have to get be excluded through the pores. The pores create all the diseases. This is another text, science text about the same period as this picture, where again he's giving this idea of this stream of waste that have to go out of the pores. This vision of waste inside the body is accompanied by development of, or the spread of a popular practice of things like this. This is a work which is about physical therapy that can replace medicines, which is talking about a self-administered enema. That is, you don't have to go to the doctor. You can you have a very conveniently designed device that allows you to administer enemas to yourself, and it works something like this. This vision continues to be influential into the 20th century, but in different forms, partly because it shapes the reception of the work of Metchnikoff, who, among other things, was a Nobel Prize winner for his work on immunology, but became famous in Japan for his essentially what is known as probiotics. The idea of the intestinal gut, sort of auto-intoxication leads to disease and shortness of life, and so you cultivate good bacteria, particularly through eating yogurt, and which is the basis of so these things which are now popular throughout Asia, and in fact have spread to many parts of the world, was created by this person named Shirota Minoru, who was inspired by Metchnikoff. But that popularity is based on this already a vision that had been cultivated in the Edo period of the putrid body. So I'm contrasting this to the traditional Chinese view of the body, which was not concerned about the accumulation of waste, but actually the depletion of vitality. To illustrate what this is a picture of the inside of the body. To illustrate what this means, if everybody could sort of follow along with me for just a second. Can you all follow my instructions? So raise your right hand. Lower your right hand. Okay. Nod twice. Clap your hands. So these are things that you do. You decide to do them. These are acts of the will. Okay. I'm going to ask you to do another act of the will. Pay attention. So what do you do when you pay attention? Yes, Susan. Now here's the last step. Pay attention to your kidneys. So what happens when you pay attention to your kidneys? What do you do? Can you pay attention to your kidneys? But that act, you can sort of imagine, right, that if you knew where your kidneys are, and had a sense, you could sort of visualize it, imagine that you're going to concentrate there. That act is essentially the meaning of this picture. This is a picture of the inside the body to allow you to envision the different parts of the body that you direct your your mind to. And as long as you can direct your mind to those parts, those are the parts in which the vital sort of divinities reside. That's the purpose of this picture. So the idea is that inside the picture is not all this excrement, but divinities that guard each of the organs. But the key is paying attention, to be able to sort of attend to different parts of the body. That's what these pictures are, so guides to guide the mind. So the idea is that there are these divinities that reside inside the body. But if you're not careful, what happens is that these divinities get distracted and they wander off. They wander out of the body and they leave it empty, they leave it depleted. And that's when you get sick, because what happens then is that evil spirits will then invade the body. So the great concern in the traditional Chinese idea of the body is the fear of depletion. Right? You always want to somehow preserve that attentiveness inside, that inner presence. So the basic structure that I'm suggesting is that under the impact of Western medicine, you go from a fear of depletion to a fear of accumulating waste. That's the argument. But if you think about it, this is very strange. How can something like this happen? Like, if you believe that you're always worried about depleting, leaking of vitality, then how could you suddenly get this new vision just because Westerners say this, right? What do Westerners know? Why would you ever think about adopting this very different vision of the body? So how can anxieties travel? There was a prior step to this that I'm going to skip over fairly quickly, but basically it goes something like this. That already by the late 17th century, there was a fear about a different kind of accumulation in Japan. That instead of accumulating excrement, there was a fear that qi would somehow pile up and form knots and congelations. And that was the primary cause of sickness. So already, by the late 17th century, before really the strong Western influence, there was a different paradigm of sickness emerging. And this paradigm was this manifest in the rise of things like massage. So people get very concerned about all the knots that if you feel around your body, you'll see everybody has knots. These palpable knots become the physical manifestation of pathology. And incidentally, this is the period when massage becomes the primary profession of the blind in Japan. In the context of there's this huge explosion of obsession about knots and accumulations, and therefore the rise of massage as a new profession. But the context of this is explicitly tied to economic prosperity. The idea is that people have become, because prior to the beginning of the 17th century, long periods of war and social turmoil, and that the great prosperity of the 17th century has made people lazy. It's created indolence. And that's what's created this accumulation. So that the new obsession with accumulation is tied up with this idea that peace and prosperity make people sick. So if you look at this picture, the other thing, I've sort of highlighted the emphasis on waste. You can also see even more prominently that it's about people working hard. That the whole concept of the inside the body is that it's sustained by labor. So you get a very different view as well of this idea of qi or ki or vitality. The traditional Chinese view of qi is basically it's a dynamic force. It's a natural force that naturally moves. What people emphasize in Edo Japan increasingly is that qi is something that's sustained. Its movement is sustained by human effort. It's by working that you make qi circulate. That when you're not working, it's going to stagnate and congeal. So there's a very famous picture by Fritz Kahn called the industry, with the body as a sort of factory, sleep ballast, where you can see the translation of the various organs into parts of a factory. But what you see in this illustration is an example of what the economic historian Hayami Akira referred to as the Industrialist Revolution. So that whereas England had an Industrial Revolution, Hayami Akira argued that in Japan you have this Industrialist Revolution where you raise productivity by just intensifying labor. It's in this period that industry becomes, that is hard work, becomes a basic ideal for human beings. So there's a prior stage of chi accumulation that leads to, that sort of is the forerunner of fears of accumulating excrement. But I want to conclude with one other aspect to this, which is the association of chi with money. So when they talk about prosperity, they always talk about the circulation of energies as well as the circulation of money. 1853, basically the same period in which you have that picture. This is a picture from an earthquake that happened in Edo. And shortly after this, you have a proliferation of pictures. This is a picture of rich men who are excreting gold. These are the people, the rich men, after an earthquake destroys a city, the rich men have to contribute money to rebuild the city. But their contributions are presented as excrement. Again, this is just the same series. They're literally coughing up gold. So that there's this association, not just in, obviously not just in Asia, between excrement and gold. So, the conclusions. The specific question I raised is what was the impact of Western medicine on Edo period Japan? And the basic conclusion is that its critical initial impact was anxieties about excrement. That the importance of anatomy comes later, after the Meiji Restoration. And retrospectively, then people start emphasizing the impact of Kaitai shinsho. But that critical impact was conditioned by prior anxieties about the new economy and the problems of a world ruled by money. The broader concerns. So what about the nature of medical knowledge? The main thing that I want to emphasize is really the need to look at the history of and how does knowledge travel. The main thing I want to emphasize with respect to the first question is the role of anxieties. This is something that hasn't really been much attended to, but we all have anxiety, fears about how we might get sick, fears of vulnerability. And my argument is that in different traditions at different times, people have different kinds of anxieties. And those anxieties shape much of daily practice. With respect to new knowledge, I want to conclude by just mentioning two phrases. One is local ecology, the other is the idea of history. New things travel, but things never travel into a vacuum. Their reception depends on the context of reception. So for example, just to take a physical example, tobacco travels from the New World, becomes very popular in China. But its reception in China, the reception of tobacco in China is conditioned by the fact that people also have prior consumption of opium, betel nuts, tea, and that there was this interaction between the consumption of consumption of tobacco and all these other elements. In the same way, what I'm suggesting is that the travel of, if it were just a question of Western ideas about excrement, it wouldn't necessarily have been taken seriously at all. But there was already this concern about accumulation that was shaped by economic change. And that the second point is that whenever one's thinking about local ecologies, one also has to look at the diachronic dimension. That is, the history of how that ecology was originally formed. So when you look at this picture, it's actually a very peculiar picture in that the person it's almost like he's looking in two different directions at the same time. And this, I think, is a good example, a good illustration or illustration of the kind of duality that you see where there's things that are coming in, doesn't displace what's been there, what was there before, but exists at the same time in the form of juxtaposition. So we just conclude by just reviewing this. Thank you. Absolutely.
Yes. Questions? I'll let you.
Susan, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm curious, in the West, particularly in the United States, and probably, I don't know how much frequently in Europe, by the 1920s, 1930s, there's such an obsession with auto-intoxication, and they're actually performing surgery to resect part of the colon, so people can have less stuff in them and move through faster. Did any of that catch on in Japan, that extreme concern on auto-intoxication?
I suppose I know there wasn't that kind of surgical intervention, but auto-intoxication becomes part of the regular vocabulary, and then it becomes a psychological disease, or psychosomatic disease. So one of the most famous sufferers from this is Yukio Mishima, the famous novelist of the 20th century, who in his Confessions of the Mask talks about how when he was a child he suffered. It becomes a childhood disease actually, and where you have this inexplicable fits and problems. So everybody becomes familiar with this word, although it changes meaning. But as far as I know, there's no surgery involved. But they develop yakuko instead. Ryan.
Regarding this, I think woodblock print or print in general, what would have been the audience for this? Would this have been targeted to doctors, to the general population?
It's a general popular print.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you would find this for sale just in the industry. So that
Probably for about as much as it would cost maybe 2 bowls of noodles. Yes, then.
At the beginning of your talk, you summarized your argument saying the idea of the stinky body filled with waste is the main contribution of Western medicine to Japanese Confucian medicine. But doesn't this idea of the filthy body filled with waste also exist in Buddhism?
It's a good question. There's definitely that discourse in Buddhism, and you can find it in Buddhist texts. It's not a prominent discourse in actual medicine. And the idea of, to extend a little further, the idea of the filthy body is the idea of a material body. So it's this keen sense of materiality. In medicine, it's not a big discourse. So there is the broad theological discourse of how the body is something that's transient, will essentially fade away, will rot away. But this idea of, another way to put it is, it's the fear of food. Basically, food is generally traditionally looked at as a nourishment. Whereas what this introduces is a concern that food is always a dangerous thing. It's that incorporation of materiality, which is subject to corruptibility.
Ryan's question leads me to ask about how far this kind of image spread outside of larger areas. When I think about Ellen Lutmore's work, she's mostly concerned with what's going on in rural medical practice. She's talking about the use of Western medical practice and existence parallel to traditional practices. But that's a very different subject from this kind of more fundamental perspective. How far does this get outside of large cities?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know. But certainly by the because we just don't have sort of access to the kinds of practice. But that domestic medicine text that I cited, right, is the kind of text that was widely distributed. And it's not for professional physicians, it's for self-care. And that's the kind of thing that they're talking about is, making sure that you purify yourself, taking advantage of animals and this kind of thing.
So looking at this image actually makes me think of sort of the current movement in Japan about sort of this promotion of meat eating and the idea of sort of meat as a source of vitality. And I wonder how this sort of interacts with this new approach towards this anxiety of, I guess, waste, accumulation of waste, but meat, which supposedly restores vitality, which in a sense sort of speaks to older, more traditional Chinese focus on sort of the fear of lost vitality. And so is it sort of like two competing sort of mindsets about body and diet and spirit interacting and sort of having a debate?
I think that's an excellent point. So there's this same period where gradually, or shortly afterwards, the meat eating debate becomes a big issue. There are the advocates who say meat is nourishing, invigorating. But in the companion illustration to this, there's also a picture of a woman as the interior. And in that picture, you have two women walking, talking to each other and saying, even women eat meat these days, so it really stinks in here. Yes.
This also seemed to, you imply universality of anxiety as a medical approach. And if I recall, I know there are theorists who tried to posit that it's specifically Western. This definitely to me seems to be a more reasonable approach to me. So has there been a general move away from the emphasis on anxiety being uniquely Western?
I don't know if there's been generally I don't think people have emphasized anxiety with respect to traditional medicine. But I think it's a basic human condition. You're worried, right? We still have these anxieties, but I think that the anxieties are different. Yes.
There has been this idea in Japan that blood types have something to do with personality.
Yes.
Now, I have heard that in 1930, when Prime Minister Hamaguchi was shot, they took him up to Tokyo University Hospital. He had a series of blood transfusions, and that this notion has something to do with that event. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know anything about this. The only thing I can say about blood is again, in later period, this is not a manifestation of the influence of Western medicine. Is the idea of aggressive bloodletting also becomes part of the therapy of certain doctors. Again, traditionally, in Asian medicine, blood and qi are parts of vitality. You don't want to lose them, but for these Japanese doctors, it's a major cause of many diseases, especially like leprosy.
So if there are no more formal questions, perhaps we can continue this discussion informally afterwards. But please, once again, join me in thanking Professor Kuriyama for this really fascinating talk.